Hi, and welcome to another edition of Conversations. What do you say we talk about John 10 this week? That's our next issue and our next chapter that we're working on and our discussion point. Take a moment to read John chapter 10. Well, if you've spent a few moments with this, you would know that Jesus talks about himself as the Good Shepherd. In Israel, in the Old Testament, the leaders were often called shepherds, for good reason perhaps, partly because David was a shepherd himself and he becomes the model of what it means to lead God's people. In fact, we're told in the Old Testament, a promise is given to David that a descendant of his would always sit on his throne, and he would be the one who would eventually shepherd God's people. That means he would basically guide them, he would lead them, he would care for them. In Israel, the leaders were often criticized for not doing this, for not taking care of people like a good shepherd would take care of his sheep. And Jesus gives himself some characteristics of what it means to be a good shepherd here, and he identifies himself this way. He indeed does care for the sheep. He says, I won't desert them in times of trouble like a hired hand will run away when trouble comes. He has an intimate knowledge of the sheep. He says, I know them and they know me, and my sheep hear my voice. And I think that's our challenge this week, isn't it? Do we really hear the voice of Jesus as he calls to us to follow him? Well, we see also a little bit more in here, as we've seen in a number of cases in the book of John, that the listeners are divided. His audience, the people of Israel, those who hear him, who see what he does. This is a divided group. Nobody can really come to grips fully with what Jesus has done. Well, I shouldn't say that. Some do, some don't. Yeah, that's probably like today. Some people believe, some don't. We're asking ourselves, do we really believe? Do we want to listen to his voice? Some of the listeners are saying, well, man, these words he's saying, they're a guy who's demon-possessed. Others will say, wait a second. These aren't the words of a guy who's demon-possessed. Demon-possessed people, maybe like we might think of today, are people who've kind of either lost touch with reality or just say outrageous things. Challenge us. Who knows? I've never met a demon-possessed person, but I know people who've just seem to have kind of lost touch with reality. They don't make sense. And these people are saying, well, these aren't the words of a demon-possessed man. More than that, in verse 21 of this chapter, some people ask a very challenging question here. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind? That's what we talked about last time in John chapter 9, and that was the blind man himself who was trying to convince the Pharisees of the same thing. Somebody who isn't from God and who doesn't have the power of God available to them cannot do the things that he did, cannot open the mind, or cannot open the eyes of a man born blind. The blind man says if God weren't with him, he couldn't really do anything. Well, John chapter 10 continues with a rather challenging statement that Jesus himself makes, and I think it creates more confusion than it does create awareness. But the fact is, Jesus makes this statement when he's asked, "Are you really the Messiah?" Well, Jesus says, "Well, I've already told you, and I've basically told you by the works that I've done. Don't believe my words if you don't want to, but at least believe the works, at least believe the things that I'm doing." And that's been John's whole point all along. He keeps giving these signs to indicate that Jesus really is who he says he is. But then Jesus makes this statement at the end of the discussion here. He says, "I and the Father are one." Well, not only is this one of the grand statements that I'm sure people have used to develop this notion of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit all being God. But the fact is, Jesus is just saying something he's been trying to say all along, that the Father is with me and I'm doing exactly what he wants me to do. So as we discuss this and as we think about this, think about a couple of things. Number one, continue to listen to this shepherd. Hear his voice. Consider the works he's done. and believe that in fact he has come from the Father, that he and the Father are one. Have a good conversation this week. We'll see you next time. Thanks.